St. Mary's Academy was a place of prestige and tradition, where students adhered to a strict code of conduct and appearance. Leah, a quiet but determined 16-year-old, was new to the school. Coming from a modest background, she had worked hard to earn a scholarship. But her family's financial situation meant she couldn't afford the exact uniforms specified by the school's rigid dress code. Her shoes, slightly worn and brown instead of the mandated black, were a small deviation, but they set the stage for a battle that would change everything. On her first day as she walked into the grand school building, she couldn't help but feel the weight of judgmental stares. The students whispered, their eyes darting to her shoes. Mrs. Harper, the stern headmistress known for her unyielding enforcement of the rules, noticed immediately. In front of the class, Mrs. Harper reprimanded Leah, issuing a warning slip and insisting the rules were non-negotiable. Humiliated but composed, Leah apologized, knowing full well she couldn't afford to replace the shoes. At home that evening, Leah confided in her mother, Sandra, who was already juggling 2 jobs to make ends meet. Sandra, heartbroken but determined, promised to find a way to buy the required shoes, even if it meant skipping a bill. Leah, however, couldn't bear the thought of her mother sacrificing more for something she felt was unnecessary. The next day, Leah returned to school wearing the same shoes. Mrs. Harper spotted them during assembly and called Leah out in front of the entire student body. This time, Leah mustered the courage to speak up. She asked, "Does the color of my shoes determine my ability to learn?" The room fell silent. Mrs. Harper, taken aback, sternly dismissed her, but whispers of support began to ripple through the student body. Leah's quiet defiance became the talk of the school. Her classmates, inspired by her bravery, began questioning other rules that seemed unnecessarily rigid. Some pointed out how the dress code disproportionately affected students from low-income families. Others brought up restrictions on hairstyles and accessories, noting how these rules stifled individuality. Despite the growing support, Leah faced resistance from unexpected places. Grace, a fellow student who had initially shown kindness, reported Leah's continued defiance to Mrs. Harper, hoping to gain favor. The betrayal stung, but Leah refused to back down. Outside the classroom, Leah's life wasn't easy. She struggled to balance her schoolwork with helping her mother at home. At times she questioned whether the fight was worth it. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered the younger students who looked up to her and the whispered thanks from classmates who were too afraid to speak out themselves. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harper began to feel the pressure. Parents started calling the school, and one local journalist published an article highlighting Leah's story. For the first time, Mrs. Harper was forced to confront the impact of her policies. Through a conversation with a colleague, she revealed her own past, growing up in poverty and believing that discipline and strict rules had been the keys to her success. She couldn't see how those same rules were now harming students like Leah. Leah's resolve culminated during a school debate. Standing in front of students, teachers, and board members, she delivered a passionate speech about how the dress code was a barrier for students like her. "Respect isn't about how we look," she said. "It's about how we treat each other." Her words struck a chord with many in the audience, though Mrs. Harper remained stoic. The turning point came when the school board called a special meeting to address the growing controversy. Leah was invited to share her perspective. Nervous but determined, she recounted her experiences and advocated for a more inclusive dress code. Her heartfelt plea moved many, and even some of the stricter board members began to question the existing policies. Unexpectedly, Mrs. Harper spoke during the meeting. Reflecting on Leah's speech and her own journey, she admitted that her rigid enforcement of the rules had been misguided. "I believed I was helping students succeed," she said, "but I see now that I've been blind to their struggles." Her vulnerability surprised everyone, including Leah. With Mrs. Harper's support, the board voted to revise the dress code, making it more flexible and inclusive. The announcement was met with cheers from students and parents alike. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at St. Mary's Academy transformed. Students felt freer to express themselves, and the school community became more supportive and empathetic. Leah, walking through the halls in her now accepted brown shoes, noticed how her small act of defiance had sparked a movement. Leah and Mrs. Harper had one final conversation. Mrs. Harper thanked Leah for challenging her and helping her grow. Leah, in turn, acknowledged Mrs. Harper's willingness to change. They parted with mutual respect, knowing they had both played a role in creating a better school environment. Leah's story became an inspiration for others. She showed that even the smallest acts of courage could lead to meaningful change, proving that sometimes, all it takes is one person to stand up and challenge the rules.